Welcome back to Stab the Dragon Productions for episode number 88. Book review number 6, The Search for Christian America by Mark Noll, Nathan Hatch, and George Marsden. This book was published in Colorado Springs by Helmers and Howard, 1983 and 1989. So this is an old book, over 30 years old for sure. I'm reviewing this because in the last few years, we're going to say, I guess since 2015 and the run by Trump for the presidential race in 2015, the election in 2016. Since that time, there have been there's been a phrase used by major media and especially by evangelical media called that talks about Christian nationalism, right? Those terms, Christian nationalism. You hear it in the secular media and evangelical media combined. And prior to 2015, I don't think I had ever heard the term Christian nationalism. It was just like a new term that popped up out of nowhere, and somehow it was related to Trump and his presidential run. And I think it's because he actively courted the conservative evangelical vote and spoke. I mean, he announced his presidency, I think, at Liberty University, and then Vice President Pence at some point spoke to the Southern Baptist Convention, during that time period, and so the news media was all up in arms about Christian nationalism. So it's been a topic, and I've started studying that, and I came across several books, or some conversations at church and other places online. A book was recommended to me by one of the elders at my church, and that's this book, The Search for Christian America by Noll, Hatch, and Marsden. I read it finally. I started it back then and never finished it, obviously. And so I started it again this year. I read it from April to September of 2022 this year. My initial take on this book is it's outstanding, yet also deeply frustrating. On a scale of 1 to 5, here's the quick take. On a scale of 1 to 5, I give this book a 5. It is exceptionally well written. I'm familiar with all three of the authors here. They've been historians within the evangelical movement and evangelical academia for a long time, 40 years, right? And so I was familiar with their work. I've read at least a couple of books from them, different authors of these three. So despite this being a 5 and it being exceptionally well written, very well documented, it kept me interested, and it presented a ton of factual information about the founding of our country and ever since then. Yet, I disagreed with it so much. The book was frustrating at times because it seemed like they would dance around the issue, contradicting themselves at times, yet making excellent points along the way. I was deeply conflicted about this book because so much of it I liked and so much of it I didn't like. But my score of a 5 shows you that even though you have a disagreement with some authors or people, you can really appreciate how they made their case and what they said. So I agreed with them and I disagreed with them. And in the end, final analysis, I think they missed it on a key point. I just don't think they got it. So now the first thing you have to understand is that, again, this book was written 30 plus years ago, 40 years ago, then revised and expanded a few years later. They were writing to and about the people and the nation of the late 1970s to mid 1980s during the presidencies of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. Now that seems like ancient history now, but I lived those years. Is a 40-year-old book about politics worth reading now? Is it relevant today? Oh, I found this book absolutely relevant. Yes. And it's a classic. I mean, if you're in the evangelical world and you like politics and history and stuff, this is a classic. They're focusing on the founding of the country. and seeking an answer to the question, was America founded as a Christian nation? I mean, it's in the title, The Search for a Christian America, right? In the opening paragraph of the book, we read this: to resist the evil of our day and to build a healthier society, we almost instinctively turn to those who have gone before for wisdom and practical guidance. At stake is nothing less than what was once widely assumed to be America's Christian heritage. Wow. That's page 13. So that's right there in the opening chapter of the book. And I find that statement fascinating because of several things there. To resist the evil of our day, to build a healthier society. Now, I think they fall short of actually recommending this. They say we almost instinctively turn to those who have gone before for wisdom and practical guidance. They don't say, oh, that's what you should do. They are describing the situation. But then they say this: at stake is nothing less than what was once widely assumed to be America's Christian heritage. Now, again, they have some qualifying language in there. The assumption of America having a Christian heritage is at stake in this going back to the founders, to those who've gone before. So again, they don't come out in favor of that, but they're saying, hey, this is the issue, this is the problem. So the authors state what is a widespread belief and then proceed to tell us why it was never so. That's my take on the book. The authors clearly state their two-part thesis. We feel that a careful study of the facts of history shows that early America does not deserve to be considered uniquely, distinctly, or even predominantly Christian. If we mean by the word Christian a state of society reflecting the ideals presented in Scripture. Now that's their thesis statement, okay? And then secondly, the authors, quote, feel also that careful examination of Christian teaching on government, the state, and the nature of culture shows that the idea of a Christian nation is a very ambiguous concept, which is usually harmful to effective Christian action in society. Page 17 is where those quotes came from. In the author's eyes, then, America was not ever, nor should it have been, a Christian nation. That's what they think. They think the nation and Christianity are better off being completely separated. And this is a pretty standard view by the Free Church, that is, Baptists. Going back to the days of Ulrich Zwingli of Switzerland and the Anabaptists that he created and then betrayed in the 16th century. Now, let me state, in my seminary education, I'm a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Fort Worth, Texas, back in the 80s. I took at least 2 or 3 classes on Christians in the political process in one way or the other. In fact, one class I took was called Christians in the Political Process. Another one was Christians in the State, or Christianity in the State, something like that. And in that class, it became, both those classes, 2 different professors. In those classes, it became very clear to me that where I was coming from and where the professors and the class in general was coming from were 2 polar opposite positions. I was taught in those classes that we as Baptists, that Christians in general, should not want the government on our side. Essentially, that was the position. And that's what these authors seem to be saying. And so the time frame there, I went to seminary in the 80s. This book was written in the 80s. So you can see that that was the common belief back then. Now, the authors cite numerous instances from the Puritans on of leaders in American culture stating that America has a divine calling. So the authors are citing this. It's a historical fact. That's what the Puritans and many leaders of American culture thought since then. That America has a divine calling, blessing, or presence, and that the nation has a mission and is founded on the principles of God's Word. Then the authors dissect that belief to show that neither America nor any other culture can be totally a Christian nation. And this is precisely the point where I depart from the authors. I do not think that they have convinced me that the historical and even present claims about America's past were ever meant to be theologically or practically precise and all defining in the same way the authors are stating. When the authors refer to the Puritans as believing this, yeah, they believed it, but guess what? The Puritans also had to make a halfway covenant. Why? Because their children dropped out of the church. On board the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, half the complement of the Mayflower were not part of their church congregation. They were worldlings. Okay? From the get-go, the Pilgrims, who were Puritans, separatists, and the Puritans of the 1630 immigration, they all understood it was a mixed society. They tried to implement God's law. They recognized that that was failing, but they kept trying. They kept trying to have good laws that were based on the Bible, but they knew that it didn't apply to all society. They had problems with that. And so I think the authors in this book missed that mark. I really do. And even the present claims about America's past are not meant to be theologically or practically precise. I don't know of anybody who says America's a Christian nation and that means everybody in America believes in Jesus. Nobody believes that. That's a specious argument. So I do not believe the conservative moral majority of the 1980s, nor the Puritan fathers ever believed that we were a Christian nation in totality, as the authors define it. I think the authors they're setting up a straw man argument and then do an excellent job of smashing it. Throughout the book, the authors seem to tacitly accept the idea of a moral and religious slide or decline in their own day. In the second chapter, the authors write this on page 40. American political developments taken as a whole may yield many Christian and Puritan influences, but they do not lead to the conclusion that there was once a properly Christian America. Yet there is at least one more major area where a case can be made for just such a conclusion. This is the area of general moral influence in helping to create a law-abiding citizenry with a strong conscience. Although the exact connections are of course impossible to document definitively, it does appear that Americans were generally well disposed to obey the civil law, to play by the rules in the democratic process, and to bring their actions and those of others under moral review. These dispositions can be traced, at least in part, to the Puritan emphases on God's law as the fundamental basis of their society. Such emphases for the Puritans involved not only the idea that the government was subject to a higher law, but also that all citizens were obliged to keep God's law. The law, said Scripture, was a schoolmaster preparing persons for regeneration, hence it seemed a valuable service for the state to require the entire citizenry to keep the law. Within that paragraph, the authors defeat themselves, I think. I mean, they're saying that, hey, the moral influence thing was real. That imposing the law of God on society in general is a good idea. So they're defeating their own argument. The authors continue to contradict their own thesis, also on page 40. Since God's law was the schoolmaster for New England, and New England to a large extent was the schoolmaster for America, Americans in the Puritan tradition indeed seem to have had an unusually highly developed internalized sense of civic and moral responsibility. Oh, you think? This Puritan conscience, in fact, still provides an important aspect of the explanation of the periodic eras of reform that shaped American political and social history. Well, there you go. In other words, the Puritan conscience, built upon God's law, trying to bring God's law into society, by the author's own words, still provides an important aspect of the explanation of reform movements that shape our political and social history. There you go. Again, the authors defeat their own argument. But then the authors deconstruct what they just said by saying, well, this is essentially moralism, and point to Benjamin Franklin as an example, or the Unitarian denomination that preached morals, not the gospel. They go into a very good theological discussion of how America lost the focus on God and became man-centered in its moralism. And all this is actually on target, and I agree with it, but they're missing the point. They're still clinging to the idea that the Puritans and those who followed and the moral majority and the people of our day think that a Christian America means everybody is of sound doctrine and believes Jesus Christ. Nobody ever says that. Nowhere. So they've built a straw man argument, and then they give evidence that, it's a false argument. So I remain unconvinced that those of us, and I was one of those in the 80s, claiming that America was once a Christian nation founded on Christian principles, who made or make these claims, ever intended or meant that we were a 100% biblical, theologically correct, born-again Christian nation. Our intent, or my intent, was to say that in our past, there was more of a respect for God and God's law in the hearts of our citizens than there is today. That's it. That broadly speaking, the American Constitution and our economic system of capitalism more closely reflects biblical thinking than anything else out there. We never said the Constitution was divinely inspired. Who says that? I don't know of anybody. We have indeed undergone a downgrade, a decline in our moral conscience as a people, and this is easily seen in our politics, our arts, and the behavior in our schools and in the streets. Those of us old guys who've been around look at society the way it was 50, 60 years ago, and then compare it with today. Oh, yeah, we're not on the moral climb here. We're in free fall, morally. Absolutely. So I stand by this assessment today in 2022. The politics of today has degenerated greatly from where we once were, almost totally abandoning the Constitution and how we're being governed. Granted, the authors wrote this book in the early to late 1980s, and they could not have foreseen the path our country has taken. But the trajectory they did notice was downwards. That comes through in their book, and today it has fallen much further. This trajectory alone points to the problem of their thesis. I fully admit, I was one of those to whom this book was addressed, and I maintain that I was right and they were wrong. At the same time, most of what they write here, I can absolutely agree with factually. Their history, their factual presentation of the status of American spirituality and the inherent contradictions within the Constitution, those things are true. But I believe their evaluation of the evidence fails because they did not understand what we meant by saying America was founded on Christianity and the Bible. Are there people out there who steadfastly believe that to be an American is to be a Christian? I think there are some. I've met some. I remember having a conversation with a lady at work 20, 25 years ago who said, well, I'm an American, so I guess I'm a Christian. And I've heard that a couple of times, actually, when I was pastoring and ministering to people. I kind of heard that. So yes, is that belief out there that, oh, I'm an American, so I must be a Christian? Yeah, sadly, there are some people who believe that. Are there people out there who think the founders were all born-again Christians? Maybe a few. I mean, David Barton of Wall Builders is kind of close to that position. And while I respect David Barton of Wall Builders, I don't agree with all of his conclusions. And some of his evidence is a little shaky too. Just as a historian, I have some disagreements with David Barton's process and his interpretation. But I still think the vast majority of those to whom these authors were writing have a different standard than the authors when they say that America was a Christian nation. And so that's the major problem with the book. Should you read this book? Absolutely. I give this book a 5-star rating. It's by 3 of America's finest Christian historians. It's well worth your time. If you can get a copy, it's out of print. Well, I say it's out of print. It may still be in print. It's available online somewhere. Buy it, read it. Every church library should own a copy of this great book, and I am our church's librarian, as you can probably guess by looking behind me. Church book clubs should read this book and engage with it. Members of Congress and state legislatures, school boards, and city councils should read this book along with a couple of others that represent the other side of the argument. Well, that's all for now. In hoc signo vinces, which, if you just heard this review, you know the big irony in me saying this Latin phrase, perhaps. Stab the Dragon, out here.